The North Sea oil and gas industry has formed a significant part of Scotland's economy since the 1970s. But the controversy over the planned development of the huge Cambo oil field off Shetland highlights the challenges faced by current politicians committed to climate action. Campaigners say new exploration should end as part of a transition away from fossil fuels, but other voices insist that drilling for oil needs to remain key to the nation's prosperity. The Scottish Secretary Alister Jack insists that the project has been priced into UK climate targets. To discuss the arguments around the project, we brought together the Alba party leader and former First Minister Alex Salmond and Dr Richard Dixon, who is Director of Friends of the Earth Scotland. Alex Salmond, why should Cambo go ahead?
I think Cambo should go ahead because if we don't licence new oil and gas developments, then the North Sea will be finished and we'll be destining 100,000 people in the northeast of Scotland and elsewhere to the dole queues. I think it's compatible with saving the planet. I think a zero carbon obligation should be put in licence conditions of every new field, backed up by a fiscal and fine regime that will make the oil companies do it, and I think we should force them into carbon capture and storage in a proper sustained way, and I think that's the way to reconcile saving the jobs and saving the planet. And I also think without carbon capture technology, I think the Committee on Climate Change is correct that the UK will not meet its carbon obligation requirements, and of course neither will Scotland.
Richard Dixon, why should it not go ahead?
Well, it's a question of whether you're serious about climate change or not. So if you're serious, you've got to stop producing fossil fuels. We're already committed to produce more than our fair share of fossil fuels from fields that are operating today. So we can't open any new ones, we can't go and look for any new areas. And as the UN Secretary General said last week, looking for new oil and gas is like digging our own grave. So Cambo is a step too far. We just can't do that. Now, where we would, of course, agree with Alex Salmond is on jobs. We need to have that transition. So we've been working for 5 years with the unions. In Scotland, there's been a 2.5-year process with a Just Transition Commission. We need to make all of that real. So renewables are a tremendous success story, partly due to Mr Salmond himself when he was First Minister and his enthusiasm. We need to make that even more so that we can make sure that if you're a diver, a welder, electrical engineer, a computer programmer in the North Sea oil industry, you can go and do a very similar kind of job in the offshore and onshore renewables industry. We can do that. We can create 3 times more jobs than we need in the green jobs. And that's the transition we need to make. But we have to be serious about setting a deadline, because I think the thing about making that transition is if we just all say, oh, well, we need a transition and we just bumble along, it's not going to happen. If we say we're going to have a transition and it's going to take this long and this is the trajectory, then you can plan properly. You can build up the renewables and the other jobs at the right pace.
What about that specific point, Alex Salmond? We've been hearing over the past few days of the climate crisis. So you touched on it a bit there, but how do you square that with developing Cambo?
Well, as I've just said, I think all new oil and gas development should have a zero carbon obligation placed upon them as a licensing condition. Well, what it means is that the company concerned, in this case Shell and the other developers, would have to demonstrate that they can develop the field in a zero carbon way, and you back it up by fines if they can't do it. And of course, you know, Cambo is going to generate some $40 billion of profit over its lifetime of 25 years if it goes ahead. And the idea that some billions of that can't be invested in a carbon capture and storage project to obtain zero carbon is ridiculous. All you need is the fiscal muscle to do it.
If Scotland has ambitions of being a leader in renewables, then why do we need Cambo?
Well, we're going to need oil and gas anyway, because oil and gas doesn't just generate power. I mean, we've now produced 1.5 times our power requirements in renewables. I think we should be producing 10 times our electricity requirements, and particularly offshore wind power. I think Scotland can do that. But we're going to need oil and gas, for example, for all the products that the Grangemouth refinery and other refineries produce. Now, people should get real about this. If you say stop oil and gas development, then it's not just going to cost tens of thousands of jobs. It's going to close Moss Morton, it's going to close Grangemouth, it's going to close St Fergus.
Let me put these points to Richard Dixon then.
In carbon capture.
Let me put these points to him. We need to get real.
Well, I think we're very real. We've been working on what the transition looks like, what the timescale should be, where the jobs will come from, and we've been arguing that case with the government for 5 years now. I think Alec is falling for a con that the oil industry is putting about, this net zero or zero emissions oil production. That's about how much energy you use to take the oil out of the ground. But it completely ignores the 20 times greater climate impact of actually burning the stuff. So that is someone else's problem, according to the oil industry. So they spin this line about, well, we'll be net zero, or we'll be a zero carbon basin, or we'll reduce our energy use in extraction. But actually the big problem is that people still use the stuff, and that creates climate change.
Are you falling for a con, Alex Salmond?
No, let me agree with Richard that I've never been taken in by the major oil companies. I mean, according to Shell, of course, there were no big oil fields left in the North Sea. That's what they said just a few years ago. Now they want to develop an 800 million barrel one. So I've never been taken in by big oil. But what you've got to do is face them with a fiscal regime that says unless they can meet zero carbon development, and that means capturing all the carbon they produce and taking it and storing it in the saline aquifers of the North Sea, then you fine them to perdition. And that's how you do it. And you don't leave it in the hands of somebody like Boris Johnson, who wouldn't know the difference between a saline aquifer and a sausage roll. And you certainly don't do it as the Scottish Government are doing just now and saying, oh, it's got nothing to do with us, Gov, let's leave it all to the big boys and girls in London. You take responsibility, you impose conditions on these companies, you back it up, and you mean what you say.
Is that realistic, Richard Dixon?
I don't think so. If you look at the last 3 years, Shell and BP paid no tax. And in fact, we, the taxpayer, gave Shell £100 million last year. So there is no real big pot of money that's going to fund this transition, which is going to fund the renewables, which is going to fund carbon capture and storage. We are letting off the oil companies scot-free on the taxes that they should be paying. There's going to be a huge bill for decommissioning all those structures in the North Sea. The government's already committed to footing a huge part of that, tens of billions. So there is no big income stream from oil and gas. We would be better off without it, as long as we can make that transition for the workers and communities. That's the drive. And we have to do that for the sake of climate change. No more new oil fields, and a serious transition with a date for when we're going to stop taking oil and gas out of the North Sea.
Very briefly and finally, if you will, Alex Salmond, is it going to happen? Will it go ahead, do you think?
Oh, I think it will, and the question is really, and let's be touched and agree with Richard, there's $40 billion of profits going to come out of Cambo for Shell and the other developers. I think we should tax that. I think we should make them pay for the climate impact of that by having a zero carbon production system and get serious about carbon capture and storage. I think a great part of our new leap forward in climate change and meeting our targets depends on that, and we should take the political power in Scotland to make it happen.
And very finally, on that point, Richard Dixon, how will the public be persuaded by the economic argument Alex Salmond's making, or the argument that we transition and promises of what might come in the future?
Well, we saw 150,000 people marching on the streets of Glasgow on Saturday. They're telling us they want action on climate change, and their big focus, interesting, has shifted. Their big thing, the biggest thing they want is an end to oil and gas. Proper transition, but an end to oil and gas. And carbon capture and storage, it's not going anywhere. UK government hasn't given money to Acorn. There are no plants in the whole of Europe doing carbon capture and storage. There were a few, they've shut. And the ones that do exist around the world, 80% of those use the captured carbon to get more oil out. So they're actually making the situation worse. Carbon capture and storage is a dream to let us keep the oil industry going. It's not a serious technology to get rid of carbon.
And very finally, in a sentence to that, Alex Salmond.
Well, I think we should be as optimistic about carbon capture and its possibilities as Richard and I were about wind power 10 years ago, when people told us it couldn't and wouldn't happen, it was too expensive, but it has happened. It's now the cheapest form of delivering electricity. We should have the same optimism about the plans for carbon capture.
Alex Salmond, Richard Dixon, thank you both for joining us on Scotland Tonight.